Hello, everyone. Welcome to another interview segment hosted by the Midwestern Marx Institute for Marxist Theory and Political Analysis. Today, we're going to be speaking with Comrade Dan Kovalik, who is a senior research fellow at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. He teaches international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, and he is the author of many books, including The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela, Nicaragua, A History of U.S. Intervention and Resistance, Cancel This Book, The Progressive Case Against Cancel Culture, The Plot to Scapegoat Russia, and many more. So thank you, Dan, for being here with us today.
It's really my honor and pleasure to be with you, comrades. I'm really excited. Thank you.
Sounds good. We'll jump right into the interview after we play our intro.
Alrighty, folks. Thank you to everyone watching. Thank you, Comrade Dan, for being here again. We wanted to start off by asking, how did you come to do the work that you did? How did you come to the left and to doing the work that you're doing now and have been doing for quite a while?
Yeah, well, again, thanks for having me on your show. And so first of all, just a little background on myself. I was raised, this is Midwest marked, and I'm a child of the Midwest. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, to a very right wing, in truth, Roman Catholic family. And so my first years were very much, I was always interested in politics, and I adopted my dad's politics, not surprisingly, when I was little. And that was anti-communism and, really into the Cold War and Reaganism and all that. And what really started my interest in the left, or started me down that road, was when Archbishop Romero was killed in El Salvador. He was a Catholic archbishop. He was murdered. We know now, but we even knew then. I mean, it was pretty well known even back then. He was killed by forces that were being funded by the United States and armed by the United States. And I was a very devout Catholic, and, that really upset me. Like, what are we doing funding guys that are killing archbishops in Latin America? Like, I thought we were defending the faith against the godless Reds, and yet we're killing these archbishops. And then several months later, the 4 church women were raped and murdered by also U.S.-backed forces in El Salvador. Again, big news. Again, I'm like, what exactly is going on? This isn't really what I thought the U.S. was about. And then finally, in 1987, so I'm, I become at least a little more, open to things. But obviously, with cognitive dissonance, you can kind of rationalize things or forget them. And, but then as time went on, I still was very interested in the war in Central America. And finally, in 1987, I was, after my freshman year at college, I was reading The Nation magazine and learned of this delegation in Nicaragua. And this was during the Contra War. And I went there for a month. I took a month off at college and went to Nicaragua. And I never turned back. I mean, what I saw there changed my life. And I actually came back home and I joined the Communist Party. is the long and short of it. And I've never given up my beliefs that I had and that I learned in Nicaragua.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know there's a chapter in Vijay Prashad's Washington Bullets called Be a Patriot, Kill a Priest. And it just goes through all the mass murder and torture of liberation theologists in Latin America. Because the U.S. and the CIA were terrified of the kind of influence that could have. So that's interesting to hear about that was what ultimately pushed you to communism. But our next question has to do with Venezuela, and I've recently been reading or rereading your book, The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
No, thank you for sending it to me. I really appreciate that. And it was interesting to hear about all the things that the revolution has done for the people, building new houses, schools, hospitals. There's one really interesting part where you talk about this beachfront location where a bunch of poor housing had been built, or housing for poor and working class people, rather than luxury housing developments for the rich. So can you talk about some of the achievements of the Bolivarian Revolution, what you saw in Venezuela, and what the Bolivarian Revolution means to the poor and working class people of the country?
Yeah, well, first of all, Venezuela in the first years of the revolution, which began with the election of Chavez in 1998. He took power in 1999. And what you're referring to is, as soon as he takes power in 1999, there were these torrential downpours in parts of Venezuela. And it was known then as Vargas State. There were these mudslides that resulted, in which thousands of people died in this mudslide. I think it's unknown how many died, because they were literally just buried alive by the mudslide. And Chavez had to react very quickly to deal with that horrible tragedy. And as I mentioned in the book, and as you just mentioned, just to skip ahead a little, ultimately they did rebuild that area, but and it's right on the Caribbean coast there. And what many countries would have done is build luxury resorts there, right? They would have used this tragedy, which demolished all these barrios, to build hotels and casinos and whatnot, right, along the Caribbean. But that's not what they did there. Instead, they did build homes for the poor, which again says a lot about the revolution. But the other thing, again, in the first years of the revolution, up till about 2000, I want to say 13 or so, the revolution had done a great job at eradicating poverty, eradicating extreme poverty, bringing healthcare, free healthcare to the people, free education, really improving the lot of the Afro-Venezuelan people, who had been really an invisible people in Venezuela. They were there, but they had no status, and they received a significant status in the Constitution of 1999, which was ratified by referendum, which again acknowledged the special status of Afro-Venezuelans, of indigenous peoples, of indigenous languages. This so that the indigenous peoples and Afro-Venezuelans were really benefited by the revolution. In fact, I mentioned in the book, I've been an election observer in Venezuela countless times. I'm really not sure how many times I have, but a number of times. And the one thing that struck me is that when I went to pro, Maduro rallies, or pro, Socialist Party rallies, almost all the people there, we would say, were black. I mean, they were black skinned. They were Afro-Venezuelans. And this again showed where the broadest support of the revolution was. And of course, in the opposition rallies, they were more, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white-skinned, well-to-do people in the opposition rallies. Again, which said a lot about what was happening. And this is something, of course, that the U.S. media always obscures. And even now, so again, even the IMF and World Bank applauded Chavez for all the things he did to fight poverty and bring these great social programs to the population. Now, at some point that, those achievements certainly were challenged by U.S. sanctions, which have only increased over time. Venezuela is one of the most sanctioned countries on earth. And not only has it been sanctioned, but the Western powers have just engaged in old-timey colonial theft from them, right? The British have stolen billions of dollars of gold from Venezuela. The U.S. stole Citgo, which was the single source of the largest single source of revenue for Venezuela. And Citgo had been Venezuela's U.S. oil and gas company. I mean, probably, a lot of you have gotten gas at Citgo at one time or another. The U.S. literally just stole that from them. And at the moment, what the administration wants to do is sell it off in parts, which would mean it would never go back to Venezuela, costing Venezuela billions of dollars. And this definitely put stalled the revolution, I would say, and set back the revolution in terms of some of its achievements. But even notwithstanding that, Venezuela has persevered, and they continue to, really take care of the poor sectors of society. Venezuela now, which had been importing most of its food at the beginning of the revolution, now is getting, very close to 100% food sovereignty. They really focused on promoting people growing their own food to eat. And so now most of the food they eat, they grow themselves, which is an incredible achievement. And that was done because, again, in part because of sanctions. Sanctions forced them to do this because they couldn't import food freely anymore. They couldn't import medicines anymore, right? So, again, they've had to turn to, making their own medicines and whatnot, growing their own food. And so now they're actually expected for their economy to grow at a record level in the upcoming years. And I think you'll see a lot more achievements. But in any case, it really has been a revolution of the poor and working class and of indigenous and Afro-Venezuelans. And that's who have supported the revolution.
Absolutely. That's a great answer. Thank you. The next question I know focuses on Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. And it's just interesting keeping an eye on the Caribbean and how the U.S. has just consistently increased military presence there. And that helps them enforce this blockade. And as they've done that, we've seen an increase of, like you said, literal piracy, where like Iran is a few years ago, sending oil tankers to Venezuela. And the U.S. military ships just boarded it and stole the oil tankers and brought them back to Houston. And, we would call this piracy or terrorism if it was someone else, if it was not the U.S. doing it. But when it's our military, it's just accepted.
Yeah, no, it's quite incredible what Venezuela has endured. And I think when people criticize Venezuela, I think they don't give it enough credit for what it has accomplished in the face of incredible opposition by the United States. Where the U.S., as you say, not only people have to understand these sanctions are not just like the U.S. saying, okay, we won't trade with Venezuela. The U.S. under international law is allowed to say that they can trade with whoever they want and not with others they don't want. All right. But what the U.S. is doing is preventing other countries from trading with Venezuela and preventing Venezuela from getting international financing from the IMF and World Bank, things that Venezuela, had been using to build housing, again, to provide food and medicine to people. And by the way, the other thing I didn't mention is housing. Even notwithstanding the sanctions, Venezuela has managed to build, at least the last count I saw was something like 3.5 million, I think, housing units for people in Venezuela, which is quite extraordinary because Venezuela only has something like, I'm not sure what the total population is now, but it's between like 20 and 30 million. So, 3.5 million housing units, that's a lot. If you consider a family four and all those on average, it's a sizable amount of the population that's gotten housing. But again, all that was made difficult by the sanctions. There's specific incidents where the U.S. blocked food shipments from Mexico, blocked again medicines from coming in for COVID, medicines coming in for chemotherapy for children, insulin, kidney dialysis machines. I mean, just very basic things people needed to survive. And as the Center for Economic Policy Research concluded in 1 year alone that they looked at from 2017 to 2018, they estimated 40,000 Venezuelans died in that year alone just due to the lack of medicine that they didn't get. They didn't even factor in that lack of food and other things. 40,000. And so if, year after year, you had that type of mortality, that's a lot of people in a not very big country, and that's what these sanctions mean. And it's been a very cruel policy towards that country. And everyone tries to focus on, they'll say, oh, the economy there is bad and, people are suffering. But they often don't focus on the sanctions that have led to that suffering,
Especially many on the Western left and many self-proclaimed Marxists in the West who expect these socialist experiments that are under the boot of imperialist hybrid warfare that make it the case that even if they survive, that is itself an accomplishment. But they always never just survive. They do amazing things for their people. But the socialists expect this great purity and this idea of socialism, how it exists in their head, to materialize itself in a world that's very difficult to even survive. And, the case of Venezuela is very clear, as it is with the other two countries that I want to ask you about. Now, you have traveled to and written about Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, three countries that have long been united against U.S. imperialism, described as well by John Bolton as the Troika of Tyranny. Can you talk about the geopolitical importance of these three countries and what they're doing to construct socialism and combat imperialism? What would you say are the key tools in the U.S.'s arsenal of attacks against these nations, and how does imperialist rhetoric on them overlap?
Yes, so these three countries for a number of years have really been the bastion of resistance to the United States and to the Monroe Doctrine, right? The Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which is still in effect, in which the U.S. made it clear that it would be the only power of influence in the hemisphere, and that no other power at that time they really meant Europe would be able to have influence in this hemisphere. And that developed over time. There was the Teddy Roosevelt corollary to this, in which Roosevelt said that the U.S. had the right to use military might to intervene in the hemisphere, in any country in the hemisphere, to protect its interests. And that has been the rule of the day, really, since that time. And the first real challenge to that, and real success against it, though it was short-lived, was Sandino's ousting of the U.S. Marines from Nicaragua in 1933. The Marines had invaded Nicaragua in around 1910. because to overthrow the president then, who was a social reformer, who wanted to work with other countries on development projects, including possibly the thought was he was going to work with Japan to build a canal through Nicaragua. All these were anathema to what the U.S. saw as its interest there. Sent in the Marines, deposed him, and were occupied Nicaragua on and off for the next, years until 1933, until finally Augusto Sandino, the legendary guerrilla leader, led mostly a peasant force to oust the Marines. This was one of the first, probably the first act in the hemisphere to really effectively resist the U.S. Though, again, it was short-lived. I won't get into a lot of details, but Sandino was, through chicanery, was murdered, and the U.S. installed the dictator Anastasio Somoza, who would rule there until the Sandinista Revolution of 1979. In the meantime, of course, in 1959, Cuba had its anti-imperialist revolution led by, of course, Fidel Castro and his brother, and Che Guevara and others. This struck the most significant blow to U.S. imperialism to that date, because they were able to hang on, unlike Sandino, and they've hung on to this day, which is quite incredible because, of course, the U.S. has economically blockaded that country since about 61 or so. So it's really almost since the beginning of the revolution. The U.S. has really isolated Cuba economically, politically, made it very difficult for that country to survive. I mean, really, in the Soviet Union helped Cuba significantly through those sanctions. And of course, once the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, that made life for Cuba very difficult. But in any case, Cuba has remained a beacon to resistance against U.S. imperial domination. Of course, the next country to have its successful revolution was Nicaragua, as I mentioned, 1979. It overthrew the U.S.-backed dictator, Anastasio Somoza. They were then electorally defeated in 1990, but have come to power since in 2007. And again, continue to be this bastion of resistance to U.S. imperialism. And then you have Venezuela, which had the Chavista revolution in 1998, which, that was the first revolution, to have, well, I guess we can talk about a few others, but let me just say the first revolution to be able to succeed for a significant time that came to power through the ballot box in 1998. A lot of people, if you read the news, you'll get the impression Chavez came to power through a coup or whatnot. No, he was elected. And in 1998 became president in 1999. Now, there were other socialist leaders, anti-imperialist leaders, elected throughout this period, but they didn't last very long because the U.S. intervened to overthrow them. Salvador Allende in Chile, who managed to hold on for 3 years from 1970 to 73, was overthrown in a U.S.-backed military coup in 1973. You had Jacobo Arbenz in 1954 in Guatemala, also democratically elected, and he was overthrown in a U.S.-backed coup. And there's a number of other examples, but that's kind of the highlights. Now, you said, well, what are the tools the U.S. uses for the attempts to overthrow these countries? I mean, the big one is economic dominance. The fact that, the dollar has been the ascendant currency in the world and in this hemisphere for years. The U.S., through sanctions, is therefore able to really crush a country economically if it chooses to do that. Now, that dollar, dominance is now starting to weaken, and so we'll see what happens. But that has been the history of it. And this even goes back to William Howard Taft and his dollar diplomacy, right, at the early 20th century, where the U.S. figured out it could use the dollar to impose, devastating sanctions on countries who were not playing ball with the United States. But the other thing it does is it supports opposition groups through a lot of money in all these countries, and it supports them to do both, kind of standard political opposition work, but also at times to carry out violent acts against these countries that the U.S. does not support. And we saw this in 2018 in Nicaragua, for example. We also saw it in Venezuela with the Garimbas in 2014 to 2017. This is very standard operating procedure that the U.S. does to fund and support kind of violent movements against the government. The first time they really did that, at least that the CIA did it, was in 1953 in Iran, and did that with great success to overthrow the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammed Mossadegh. But that's a tool that they use till now. And of course, if none of those things work, the U.S. will at times use, overt military intervention, send in U.S. troops to overthrow a government. And they've done that a number of times. They did that in the Dominican Republic in 1965. Lyndon Johnson sent in the troops there to overthrow the government. In 1989, George Bush Sr. sent in the military to overthrow the President Noriega there because he refused to continue allowing Panama to be a base of operations to support the brutal Contras against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. And in Haiti, we've done it multiple times. Probably the most recent time that we know of, at least, was in 2004 when both the U.S., France, and Canada kidnapped the president of the country, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, and against his will flew him to the Central African Republic. I mean, people just don't even know this fact. This is in 2004. I mean, for me, this was yesterday. So this sort of even direct intervention continues to this day. And there's been numerous other coups the U.S. has supported behind the scenes against Manuel Zelaya in Honduras in 2009, Evo Morales in Bolivia in 2019, most recently in Peru this year against the Castillo government. And now U.S. troops are in Peru after that coup. So those are the main instruments the U.S. uses for its dominance in not only in this hemisphere, but really throughout the world.
Brilliant. Thank you, comrade. You mentioned at one point there the weakening influence of the dollar. This is a phenomenon that's being described more and more as de-dollarization. The journalist Pepe Escobar, in a recent article, he cited a statistic that by 2030, it could be the case that international trade in dollar goes down to around 30%, and that at the moment it's hovering just about above the 50 or so percent line. How do you think this is going to influence the force of American sanctions, and how is it going to influence the hybrid warfare toolbox of the U.S. in general?
Well, I think and I hope that it will weaken that tool of the United States, and I think that's what countries that are de-dollarizing are hoping as well. And what's happened is that at the present time, the U.S. has about 1/3 of the world's population under sanctions. I think it's something like 35 countries or something. And of course, in response to this, these countries under sanctions have said, well, we have to find workarounds, right? We can't rely on the U.S. dollar. We can't trade with the U.S. dollar. We can't use the Western banking system. we have to find a workaround, or otherwise we're not going to be able to trade at all. We're not going to be able to buy oil. We're not going to be able to buy anything that we need. And so, of course, they've turned more and more to other currencies, like the Chinese currency. Some have even turned, a couple have turned even to things like Bitcoin, interestingly enough. But this really accelerated after the beginning of Russia's special military operations in February of last year, where now Russia, China, Iran, other countries are saying, look, we have to find a way to trade on either our own currencies or another currency that we're going to create. And they've started to think about that, how they're going to do that. And they've, talked about gold-based currencies that they would trade upon. And now, of course, in Latin America, Lula in Brazil's talking about a currency for Latin America, which, again, would very much threaten U.S. hegemony and its ability to sanction these countries. Of course, another person who mentioned doing the similar thing was Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, who was trying to create a gold-backed currency in Africa. And this is one of the big reasons NATO overthrew him, because they saw this as a huge threat to, again, their ability to dominate Africa. But you're going to just see this more and more. These countries are going to find a way to trade outside the U.S. dollar, outside Western banking systems, and it will weaken the U.S.'s ability to dominate the world. And I think that's a good thing. Now, in the meantime, look, the truth is, it will hurt countries that still depend on the dollar, including the United States. The dollar you and I trade on, the dollars we have in the banks, they will become less valuable. That's a fact. And obviously that's sad. It will hurt the most vulnerable people. But the truth is, it's something that has to happen, given how the U.S. has used that dollar dominance to really not just dominate other countries, but to destroy their economies. And destroying economies means making poor people suffer. That's what it means. And that's what it has done. And that's why it has to end.
Awesome. That was a great answer. It taught me a few things about de-dollarization, which will be interesting to follow. It's definitely still in the process, of unfolding here. So it'll be interesting to see what happens and what kind of currency other countries end up going to. But to switch gears here a little bit and talk more about the Russia-Ukraine situation. A few weeks ago, we had a debate with an American political commentator who told us his view on the issue is that Putin is not a rational actor and that the Russian special military operation was unprovoked and completely offensive, an offensive invasion of Ukraine. So do you agree with this assessment of Putin, that he's an irrational actor? And if not, what do you think his rationale was for launching a special military operation?
Yes, I think he is a rational actor. I think the claim that this was somehow unprovoked is honestly just absurd. That is just not looking at the facts of the situation at all. First of all, let's look at the countries that Russia has directly intervened in outside, any country that it's intervened in directly militarily, in the last years, say since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the last decades. You're really only talking about a few countries, right? One in South Ossetia, right, which was part of Georgia. In Syria, beginning, I believe, in 2013, to counter the U.S.'s really terroristic war against that country. And in Ukraine, you're talking 3 countries, okay? How many countries has the U.S. intervened in since 1991? It'd be hard to count, right? It's a number of countries. So first of all, compared to the United States, Putin is a much more rational actor than any of our presidents, right? The U.S., should I count how many times we've gone? I mean, again, if you start in 1989, the Panama intervention, again, these are just direct military interventions where we've sent troops. Panama, 1989, Iraq, 1990, Serbia 1999, and I'm going to be skipping some, I'm sure, but just off the top of my head. Afghanistan in 2001, and that lasted for 20 years. Iraq again in 2003. Libya 2011. Of course, Somalia on a number of occasions. These are at least the major U.S. military interventions, and that doesn't count the other places where we merely sent special forces or CIA or whatnot. We have intervened in many more countries, and to worse effect. I mean, so not only one has Russia not intervened particularly much, and only on its borders, by the way, okay? The U.S. is going halfway around the world for these interventions, and that's another thing to point out. So, but let's talk about Ukraine specifically. What happened to bring Russia into Ukraine? So there was this U.S.-backed coup in 2014, which overthrew a democratically elected president in Yanukovych, quelle surprise, and put in power an ultra-right-wing government that was aligned with neo-Nazis. And actually, as the former president of Uruguay, the beloved Jose Mujica, said, you can't even call them neo-Nazis. They're just straight up Nazis, right? Because they trace their roots back to the 1920s. Okay. And very quickly after that coup, that government began attacking the Russian language, attacking Russian culture, and actually engaging in some physical attacks on Russians, the most famous being the attack on the Odessa trade union building, where people were, that building was set on fire. People were burned alive in there. At least 48 people died in that, mostly Russian-speaking people. And this all led two republics, Donetsk and Luhansk, which are in majority Russian-speaking locales, to hold referendums to become autonomous from Ukraine. They didn't want any part of any of this. And what then started was a civil war, essentially, where the government of Ukraine was attacking its own people in Luhansk and Donetsk. And in a very brutal war, which again involved neo-Nazis or Nazis who directly attacked people in these regions and areas, which I visited, by the way, in November. I visited Donetsk, not Luhansk. And by the time Russia begins special military operations in 2022, over 14,000 people had already died in this other conflict, right? Which now our media wants us to forget. Not only is that true, but that conflict, which had been pretty, frankly, kind of on a warm burner, simmering burner, since about 2015, began to heat up again in 2021 and beginning of 2022. This is what really brings Russia in. So, according to the OESC, I believe I get that right, the Organization for European Security and Cooperation, which is a 57-member body, okay, has many Western countries on it, including the U.S. Right now, a German is the head of it. So this is not a pro-Russian organization. According to them, there were over 2,000 ceasefire violations between the government in Kiev and those two republics in the weekend before Russia intervened. And that was a huge increase over what had been direct military confrontations in the prior many months. So the Russia's seeing this. Oh, well, there's this major escalation. Also, something like 60 to 100,000 Ukrainian troops were mounting on the border of the Donbass, in which Luhansk and Donetsk are located. And Russia saw, look, they're gonna engage in a full-scale invasion of that region. They may very well carry out a genocide there, and they may not even stop there. They may go into Russia proper. And Russia said, "That's it. We're not going to wait for that to happen." And they went in, and everyone knew this was going to happen. All Russia asked for was a few things to prevent this from happening. One, that Ukraine not be admitted to NATO, and that Ukraine stop attacking the Donbass. Instead, the attacks on the Donbass increased. I believe the figure, my recollection is by 30-fold before the intervention. And so finally, Russia said, that's it. We have to intervene. Now, it's very interesting how, this was, really procedurally set up to do as this was happening. And one of the groups that is very significant in this is the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which is the second biggest party in Russia, and it is the legal successor to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So it is the, successor to Lenin and Stalin and, the Soviet leaders. So it's an important party. And for communists, obviously, it's significant. Well, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation had been pushing for Russia to directly intervene in the Donbass since 2014, first of all. They thought that really they should have gone in to prevent all these deaths that ended up happening, right? Which did not happen. But as 2022 rolls around, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation puts in a resolution in the Duma, which would, if signed by Putin, require Russia to recognize Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states. Up to that point, Russia had not done that, and Russia had not directly intervened, even though a lot of people in Russia thought they should, including the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. So in truth, Putin's showing a lot of restraint here for these 8 years or so. And so the Communist Party puts in that resolution. It was passed in the Duma, and Putin signs it, and he recognizes the two republics for the first time as independent states, based on their referenda that they held in 2014. And so now, as Ukraine accelerates its attacks on these two republics, and now is threatening with these huge troops to attack the Donbass. Now Russia says, well, we now recognize you as independent states, and we also recognize you as allied states, and we're going to go in to protect you under Article 51 of the UN Charter, which gives a right of collective self-defense. And that's how it went. And that's what Russia did. And it was, I was one of the first, I think, Western lawyers to write a piece, which I did in April of last year, arguing that Russia had a legal right to do that based on the things I just said.
That's wonderfully said. What can be questioned is the rationality of people who think that what Putin did was somehow irrational, because as you mentioned, the incredible amount of restraint that was shown on his part. If anything, one of the criticisms that the Communist Party has had for the last 8 years is how long it took to intervene. This is a comment that Cobra Commander here puts. But just to switch to a part of the conversation that's always forgotten in the West, you mentioned that you traveled to Donetsk last year in November. How do the people in Donetsk, but in the Donbass in general, how do they feel about 2014 and the Maidan coup? And how do we feel about these last 8 years where they've just been constantly getting shelled and have lost 14,000 of their brothers and sisters? And how do they feel subsequently about the beginning of the special military operations?
Well, first of all, they were relieved when Russia finally intervened. They had been waiting for 8 years for that to happen. Um, I'll give you what I learned of a phrase that they use there. So Donetsk was known until 1961 as Stalino. And they have a saying, Donetsk. First Stalingrad, now Stalino. And what do they mean by this? As you know, comrades, very well, Stalingrad was the situs of a major battle between the Soviet peoples and the Nazis who invaded the Soviet Union. And through great effort, through a great loss of lives, the people of Stalingrad, after I think 2 years, was it 2 years? I think, finally routed the Nazis and began sending them back to Berlin. This was considered the great, maybe most monumental battle, really or the most significant battle of World War II that shifts the balance of forces towards the Allies and against the Germans, okay? And so when they say from Stalingrad to Stalino, they mean, okay, they did it in Stalingrad against the Nazis. We're going to do it here in Stalino, now known as the Donetsk People's Republic, against these new Nazis that have invaded our land. And they look at it that way. It's very interesting. Something else I didn't know. I mean, Donetsk, first of all, had been in, Ukraine was invaded by the Nazis, including Donetsk. Although at that point, Donetsk, to be very clear, I believe Donetsk was still part of Russia at that time. Is that the case? I think it was. I'm not positive. But Donetsk originally was Russian, and it was a very key part of the Russian Revolution. I can't say for sure if it was part of Russia, but it was part of the Soviet Union, is the point. And it was invaded, and the Nazis built a concentration camp there, at least one. And they threw 75,000 people, many alive, into a mass grave. 75,000 in Donetsk City, into a mass grave. This is the second biggest mass grave in the world. And there's a memorial to that in Donetsk. So they're never going to forget what happened to them during World War II. And they see their struggle now as a fight against neo-fascism and neo-Nazis. And I can tell you, people are relieved the Russians came in. Life has gotten better since they've come in truth. They feel more protected. The economy is now, economic and social life have come back to life. When I was there, people were going out to the bars and restaurants and going to work and driving around. And there was reconstruction that the Russians were sponsoring, building hospitals, building schools, repairing things that continued to be shelled by Ukraine. I visited Mariupol, which is part of the Donetsk People's Republic, but that's where the big battle at the steel mill was last summer. That's being reconstructed as well. I saw a huge housing project that the Russians were working on there. Believe me, I can tell you for sure the people in Donetsk are happy that the Russians are there, and they're never going back to Ukraine, and they're never going back because of how Kiev's treated them, how the government in Kiev has treated them. I mean, the government in Kiev has no one to blame themselves. That the Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea that I just visited will never go back to Ukraine after this treatment. So that's what I saw in Donetsk. And the other thing, again, is communists. It's very interesting about Donetsk is that a lot of people there are still very loyal to the Soviet Union. In fact, people would tell me, I'm not Russian, I'm not Ukrainian, I'm Soviet. And a lot of Russians told me that, by the way. The Soviet legacy is still very powerful in Russia and in Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea. And that's something we should take heart in. When I was there, again, I'm getting a little off the track here, but when I was there from May 9th of this year, which is Victory Day. I've never seen so many Soviet flags. I've never seen so many people carrying Soviet flags, waving them on their cars. I've never seen so many hammers and sickles. And by the way, I was told this is a new thing. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, you really hadn't seen this mass display of the symbols of the Soviet Union. But this has really been brought out by the special military operation. People all of a sudden are expressing their patriotism towards the Soviet Union again. So again, for you all as Marxists, as communists, this is something you should take note of, and this is something I hope that the Communist Party of the Russian Federation will take advantage of, because this is a real moment there.
Gave me chills. I don't know about you, Eddie, but I'm excited to hear you speak about the affinity that the people in Donetsk and Crimea and Mariupol still have with communism.
In fact, can I just mention? So I was with a guy, Igor is his name. He's from Odessa, but he went to Donetsk to volunteer for the Donetsk People's Militia, and he fought in Mariupol. He fought to liberate that steel mill in that brutal battle. And he said to me, Dan, we didn't raise the Russian flag when we took it. We didn't raise the Donetsk People's Republic flag. We raised that flag, comrades. We raised that flag. And he showed me a picture. He was very proud of that. So that flag is still being unfurled. And again, to me, it brings chills. That is my flag. I only have one flag. It is the crimson flag. And that's the only flag any of us should have. That's what I'm loyal to, And to see people there still loyal to that, that's a beautiful, beautiful thing, So, sorry, I get a little emotional, because I saw the Soviet Union collapse as a young man. And believe me, I have been, it was like losing a lover. My heart has been broken ever since. And to see at least the glimmer of it, at least the, some of the light still shining from that. It's a very important thing. It gives me some hope. It really does. I've never been so hopeful as I am right now in my life, truthfully, politically. So
that's awesome to hear. Same flag they unfurled when they defeated the Nazis too. I mean, the symbolism.
That was the flag. Of course it was. That is the flag. There's that quote by Ernest Hemingway, that the, freedom-loving people owe more to the Soviet Union or to the Red Army than they can ever repay, right? And he was talking about the defeat of the Soviets over the Nazis. They lost 27 million people defeating the Nazis. 85% at least of the Germans who died during World War II died on the Eastern Front. The war between the Soviet Union and Germany began in 1941 with the invasion of the Soviet Union. D-Day was not till 1944. There was not a Western Front till 1944. People don't realize that. The West came late to the party. They came as the Soviets were hurtling towards Berlin. And they went into Normandy because they didn't want the Russians to get there first. And again, that's a history we have to remember. And believe me, every Russian remembers that history. And the idea that now the West is denying the Soviets' role in World War II, trying to pretend that it was the U.S. and Great Britain and France that was aligned with Nazi Germany for most of the world, that somehow they defeated Hitler. This is sickening. And even, on May 9th, and I listened to his speech, Putin, even through all this, through all of what's happening, he recognized the U.S. and British's role in helping the Soviet Union defeat Hitler. He said that on May 9th of this year. When the U.S. spoke about it, they did not mention the Russian or Soviet role. And there was a celebration this year for the liberation of Auschwitz. And Russia which of course in the form of the Soviet Union liberated Auschwitz, was not invited to that celebration. So, we're living through a time of great historic denial and falsification that we have to fight against. But again, to be in Russia and to see the people celebrating this, a lot of them had can I show you? I have a prop. 1 second. So a lot of people I saw with this hat, you see Comrade Lenin, I have him dressed up for May 9th. They were wearing this hat, which was the Soviet hat during that time with the hammer and sickle. I saw a lot of people on the streets on May 9th with that. I also have him in his Pioneer scarf. But anyway, everyone should have a bust of Lenin in their house. But anyway, to see that's amazing. Seeing little kids with hammers and sickles on there, you still see that, So anyway, I thought that was relevant given the venue here. So there you go.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's awesome to hear. And we never get the perspective of people in Donetsk or Lugansk or the Donbass territories here in the West. So, it's so valuable to hear from you who's actually, been there and talked to these people and seen them brandishing the hammer and sickle. So you also visited Crimea as well recently. So in the West, we often get the narrative that Russia invaded and annexed Crimea in 2014. Is this true? And in your experience, did the people of Crimea seem like they wanted to belong to Russia or that they wanted to belong to Ukraine?
Yeah, it's very clear that the people in Crimea are happy being part of Russia. And it's prospered a lot. In fact, you can read mainstream papers. I think the Washington Post, even I saw an article from 2020 where they concluded, they did a poll and they talked to people there and they concluded people are very happy being part of Russia. And they said because Russia by that time had invested $20 billion in Crimea. So before the special military operations of last year, even the Western press was honest. Yeah, okay, we're not happy about it, but the Crimeans are happy being part of Russia, right? Let me give you a little history of Crimea just so people understand, why they would think this. So first of all, Crimea became part of Russia in 1783. Catherine the Great annexed it as part of Russia, and they became part of Russia at that time. So, you're looking back at over 200 years of history with Russia. And it was continued to be part of Russia and then the Soviet Union until 1954. By the way, in the meantime, in 1921, as part of the Soviet Union, actually became an autonomous republic of its own, but it was continued to be part of the Soviet Union. In 1954, Nikita Khrushchev gave Crimea kind of by fiat to Ukraine, even though, again, the people of Crimea, by culture, by language, really didn't have a lot of there. And there were Ukrainians living there, but they were a minority, So most of the people in Crimea weren't crazy being part of Ukraine. But as people told us in Crimea, who we talked to about this whole history, they said, well, but no one really cared that much because we were still all part of the Soviet Union, and no one thought in 1954 the Soviet Union was going away. So it's kind of 6 to 1, half a dozen of another. But then this began to change, even before the Soviet Union collapsed. In 1989, so this is 2 years before the Soviet Union collapsed, but of course the East Bloc has collapsed by then. The Warsaw Pact has collapsed. In 1989, the Ukrainian SSR passes a new language law which makes Ukrainian the only national language of Ukraine, of the Ukrainian SSR. So that would include Crimea. This starts to set off some alarm bells amongst the people in Crimea, saying, oh, maybe things are going to change for us, right, being part of Ukraine. So in January of 1991, as the Soviet Union becomes even more and more fragile, the Crimeans hold a referendum in which I think 94% of Crimeans vote to again become an independent, autonomous Soviet republic, like they were from 1921 to I guess till 1954. Okay. And but then the Soviet Union collapses by the end of 1991. This wasn't all worked out, what this was going to mean. I mean, all the parties, including Ukraine, were, they respected the referendum, but it wasn't clear how this was going to, play out administratively. Then the Soviet Union collapsed, which meant all the republics became their own countries. And at that point, Ukraine continued to consider Crimea as part of Ukraine, and to treat it as such, even despite this referendum in January 1991. And immediately it was not a happy marriage because, again, Ukraine immediately tried, engaged in more and more acts of what they called the Ukrainization of the country, meaning trying to make the Ukrainian language and culture the dominant one over the Russian one, over other ones as well. And so, by the way, first of all, in 1998, the Crimean Parliament passes their own language law, memorializing Russian, Ukrainian, and Tatar as the three languages of Crimea, despite whatever Kiev was doing. They said those are our three national languages, which also tells you something, right? They didn't make it Russian. They said it's going to be the three language: Russian, Ukrainian, Tatar. So even now, Crimea is starting to push back a little bit. But by 2014, with the coup there, with the troubles happening in the Dom, threats being made against the Russian population, the Crimeans finally said, we're done. We want out. And we think actually we're safer with Russia. We just want to go with Russia. They held a referendum. Again, 94% of the population, something like that, voted to go with Russia. And again, if you can find all sorts of mainstream articles in years after that saying they were happy with that decision. They're clearly happy. Russia's invested, again, $20 billion or more in that country, in Crimea, which had been basically, by the way, ignored by Ukraine in terms of investment and whatnot. After the referendum, at some point, Ukraine cut electricity off to Crimea for 8 months. People didn't have electricity. They dammed a river that fed fresh water into Crimea. So the Ukraine did nothing to endear itself to those people after the referendum either, right? Russia's helped restore the electricity. They bombed the dam after the special military operations so that water's flowing again. We saw the big reservoir that holds water from that river. It's now full. So I can guarantee you, people in Crimea have no interest in going back to Ukraine. And there's no way they're going back. I mean, this is not going to happen. It's not realistic unless, again, Ukraine and the U.S. decide they want to commit genocide there. I mean, if they just want to take back the land and not the people. But they're not getting those people back. They don't want anything to do with it.
Wonderfully said, comrade. To switch gears a little bit, you've also written a book on why progressives should combat cancel culture, with the great title, Cancel This Book. Can you tell us a bit about why it's so important to fight cancel culture and other liberal phenomena which have found themselves rampant, unfortunately, in the modern left?
Yes. I mean, what I saw, first of all, I should explain, I do explain it in the book why I wrote the book. It was informed by something that happened here in Pittsburgh. A very long time peace activist named Molly Rush, who was in her day pretty famous for being involved in this plowshares action against nuclear weapons with the Berrigan brothers and others. She was arrested at the time. And she co-founded the Thomas Merton Center here in Pittsburgh, which is a peace and justice group in Pittsburgh. It's one of the oldest peace and justice groups of its kind in the United States. And she continued activism throughout her life up until the present time. She's in her 80s now. But in 2020, she reposted, someone had posted some meme which was critical of some of the violence that surrounded the BLM protests that summer. And she merely reposted the meme. And people immediately jumped on her in social media, attacked her. So she very quickly took the meme down and she said, "I'm sorry, I've learned a lot from this." But that wasn't enough for people. The Thomas Merton Center itself, the board, put out a public letter saying that they would now disassociate themselves with Molly Rush. They would no longer work with her. They removed her name as a co-founder of the Thomas Merton Center and canceled her. I mean, this was actually a case of true and thorough cancellation, where she was basically eradicated from participation and even from the memory of the Thomas Merton Center. And I was good friends with Molly Rush and involved in the Thomas Merton Center. My ex-wife actually was the executive director of it for a time. And I was just horrified by this. And this is there's many examples you can find of this in many towns. Where someone does something on Twitter or Facebook or social media, or says something or writes something that someone finds as offensive. Maybe objectively it is offensive or it's not. But the point is, it's one slip of the lip and they're done. They're done. Everything they've done for 50 years is eradicated. And this is a horrifying thing, not just as a leftist, am I saying, as a person I'm saying this. There is just this certain lack of forgiveness and the ability for people to, find redemption. And this, and I think you guys have a book out that gets into this question of purity, where there's the demand for 100% purity. And we can't demand that. We're human beings. We're not pure. None of us are pure. Again, I was raised Catholic. We are all sinful people. We're all born with sin. And he who is not sin casts the first stone. I think all of those values are important. Even as communists, we have to, we should try to help each other improve, but to cancel out persons, to throw people out of our groups for small mistakes, destroys the movement. And it has destroyed the movement. The movement is in very bad shape in this country. And I think this type of, fetishism of purity is part of why it is where it is. And we do the same things not just to each other, but to leaders, to historical leaders, right? It's like, oh, well, that guy did something bad, and okay, well, forget about him. Lenin did this, and so forget about him. And Fidel did this, so he's bad. And they don't look at the great things that these people did. They don't look at a balance sheet. I think you have to look at the balance sheet of people's lives. Yeah, okay, this guy did this, and that was bad, and that maybe cost some lives. But how many lives did he save by what he did, and what did he do for the world? And those are important discussions. It's not a simple question when you talk about people and you talk about leaders. That's why I wrote the book, and that's what I wrote the book about. And I talk about many instances of it, and many different issues. But we live in a time now where people are being censored and canceled and vilified and attacked because people just basically don't agree with some things they say. And that's not, leftists have always been known for their very vigorous debates amongst themselves, very energetic debates, to say the least, right? And that's what we should encourage, not trying to cancel people because we disagree with them. You know, we should win them over. If our position's right, we should be articulate enough to win people over to our position, not to say, because you disagree with us, you're out. And I'm not even going to tell you why, or, you know, whatever. So that's it. You know, that's my view on that.
That's wonderfully said. And I think it comes from such a place of ignorance, because do these people think that they've been themselves perfect their whole life? Because if they realize that they have changed as well with time, then if what they perceive to be a mistake in someone else, they have to understand that, you know, if it's really a mistake, they can potentially change. And the best approach to helping them change is not just canceling them and putting them aside. But part of the paradox is also that while our comrades end up being too impure to support, and so impure that we must cancel, a lot of these same people don't find imperialism impure enough to not support at the end of the day. And Jim Crow Joe ends up being, you know, always in their assessment of the lesser of two evils, you know, the person that we end up voting for. So it's a paradox at the core of their purity fetish and their cancel culture, which, you know, the things that are cancelable are sometimes connected to the things that in other areas end up substantially opposing the existing order. And then they have this blind spot for these other very, very much more imperfect things that they end up supporting at the end of the day.
No, I think that's a great point. You know, people tend to be canceled for things they say, and maybe for, you know, certain, you know, whatever, sexual proclivities or whatever. And then meanwhile, as you say, a guy like Biden, who is leading us to World War III, may lead us to nuclear war, they don't care about. They don't care that he's, you know, has been supporting the war in Yemen, which is the worst humanitarian crisis on earth. People don't care Obama, how many people he killed, you know, with drones and bombs. And in Libya, the fact he destroyed a nation in Libya, the fact that now, because of what he did and his NATO allies did in Libya, there are now slaves being sold in public markets. That's not cancelable, right? He's still a great guy, right? But then someone who, again, has some meme we don't like, they're cancelable. It's just silliness. I mean, it's really, but you know what what it comes down to a lot of times, and this is what's the most upsetting, that we try to cancel people that we have more power and status over, right? Mm-hmm. Someone like Amali Rush in Pittsburgh, yeah, she's been around a long time and has a certain notoriety, but she's cancelable. She's an old lady who could be canceled. Obama, you know, when we think about trying to cancel someone, we're like, oh, well, that guy, how could we cancel him? He was a president, so we won't even attack him, right? I mean, part of it is a weird thing where, you know, we're kicking down instead of punching up, which is what we should be doing, is punching up. We should be holding our leaders accountable for, as you say, much worse things, trying to win over our comrades, right? And treating them with a certain amount of forgiveness and whatnot. Instead, it's the reverse. And as leftists, that's not how we should deal with the world, right? It should be, we go after, we speak truth to power. That's what we need to be doing. Not thinking that by virtue signaling, you know, with the rank and file that we're doing something, because we're really not. So except destroying our own ranks. I mean, you know, if you think that's good, but, you know, and you think about, you know, I was just reading, you know, I just finished a couple books. One was "In Quiet Flows the Dawn," which is a book written during the Soviet days, but it deals with people living on the Don River in Rostov at the turn of the century. And, you know, these are poor peasants who live horrible, terrible lives. They do terrible things to each other, live very violent lives within their homes, etc. And, you know, these are the people that were, you know, were the foundation of the revolution. the Russian Revolution. Could you imagine if everyone who had done something bad or ignorant was canceled? They wouldn't have a revolution, right? They were ignorant people who had many blind spots, and yet they built a revolution from those people. Those people built a revolution. And again, the idea that you would ask for purity from people like that is a joke. It's a joke. And that you would want that type of purity now means you just don't want a revolution. If you don't want to work with that guy in West Virginia, and I met a lot of these guys working at the steelworkers who came into my office and they had they had their T-shirt with the American Eagle on it, and they had a tattoo with, and God Bless America on it, and they, talked with a West Virginia accent, and they weren't the most polished people, and you saw them coming, and they were riding their Harley Davidson, which, by the way, steelworkers make Harley Davidsons. A lot of liberals that run from those people say, they got to be racist. These were some of the most nicest, intelligent people, best trade unionists I ever met, anti-racist, not because they were told to be anti-racist or whatever, but because, they just happen to live with black people, and that's okay with them, but it's not a thing. If you can't work with those people, you're finished. I'm sorry. You're not going to make a revolution. You're out to lunch. And, the left in this country has gone down a bad road because they see those people as deplorables, And I learned a lot from people like that. And by the way, they were willing to learn from me too. My office had all these hammers and sickles and Lenin and all, and they come in and they didn't know what any of it meant, but they were very curious about it and very interested in talking about it. And, we had many discussions about stuff like that, and it was delightful, and I don't want to be Pollyannish. Obviously, a lot of those folks have their demons, again, like the rest of us, but they certainly were not irredeemable people. And by the way, a lot of them wanted the union to endorse Bernie Sanders. They thought he was the guy. And when the union went and endorsed Clinton, that's when they ended up supporting Trump. And one could disagree with them supporting Trump, but it wasn't inevitable. They wanted Sanders first. So what does that tell you about these people? It tells you these are people you can work with. And, we have to see that in people. We have to see the possibilities in people, not the failings. And again, I give examples in the book, people I learned about that I found fascinating. There was a Justice Black in the Supreme Court, and he was pretty liberal on the Supreme Court. He was, I think, a Kennedy appointee. Anyway, when he was a kid, he was in the Ku Klux Klan. But as he got older, he changed his views. And what they said about Justice Black is they said when he was young, he wore a white robe and scared black people. When he was older, he wore a black robe and he scared white people. We should welcome those people. We should want more of those people, right? So anyway, and I came from, my dad was pretty racist and pretty backwards in many ways, but I wasn't going to cancel him, and I think he's grown a lot since I've known him even, people can grow. Anyway, I probably said too much, but that's my view on that subject.
No, that was awesome and super relevant. Like you said, relates to the book Carlos just published, The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism. And yeah, we couldn't agree more. One of the best organizers where Carlos and I met each other, and one of the people who honestly is responsible for making me a communist, was also a member of the KKK back in the day. But for the last 20 or so years, he's been one of the staunchest, most hardworking organizers in the community. him and his partner. So yeah, don't give up on people. And we always say, you know, if you cancel people and just push them away, well, they're going to go hang out with other Trump supporters or whatever.
Right.
How are you going to, you know, get people away from these ideas if you can't even have a talk with them or give them room to change their mind?
That's exactly right. And that's our job. As organizers, that's our job, is to reach out to those people. And if we can't win them over, that's our bad. You know, that's our bad, you know, because that's what we should be doing. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's a good message for people. And I know you're all doing good work. I mean, that's why I've been excited to be on this show. I know you're reaching out to people, doing great work. And, you know, I'm just an old guy trying to make my way in this world. So, there you go.
Well, it's been such an immense pleasure, brother. We got to have you back on again. It's been a delight talking to you. Is there anything you would like to plug? Any books, articles? I saw you recently put one out in Monthly Review that was really good on Nicaragua. And
yeah, I guess the one thing I'll plug, if I have it handy, this is my newest book on Nicaragua History of U.S. of U.S. intervention and resistance. So I'd certainly urge people to check that out. But any of my books, I'm on Twitter at Daniel M. Kovalik. Check me out on Twitter. You know, we're friends on Twitter, us, and we riff off each other. You know, so those are good things. I guess that's pretty much it. I have some new articles out on our trip to the Crimea. My friend Rick Sterling and I, who went there, we have a series of 3 articles out. But all of those I posted on Twitter, so you could find those there.
Sweet. I've also linked your Amazon page with all of your books there for the audience.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot. And by the way, for people, let me just say, buying a book on Amazon, I know we hate Amazon, but, you know, it does a lot for authors. It helps with our algorithms and whatnot, and it helps me, you know. So, you know, please buy a book or so, and because it does make a difference. I'm just trying to get the word out. I'm not making much money on this, barely any, really. But I'm just trying to get the word out, and it helps. So,
the larger Amazon gets, the better it is when we nationalize it. That's
right. There you go. And again, it is a lifeline for authors. I mean, that's just the truth of it. We may not want to admit it, but it's the truth. I try to be truthful. Whether I know it's not popular to promote Amazon, but it is what it is. So, and also, if you like my books. A key thing. So I see someone saying, I'll buy a book or 2. Thank you. I've seen some nice comments, by the way. I'm sorry I didn't react to. And I'm not a real techno guy, but thank you all for the nice comments. If you put a nice review on Amazon for me, but that is huge. That is freaking huge. So again, those are things I'd be very grateful for. And I hope to meet you all in person and hope we can work to build socialism. That's what it's about.
You bet. Likewise, brother. We're going to roll out then to the International the same way we came in.
Great.
Stick around, Dan, so we could talk to you a little bit afterwards, by the way.
Okay.
cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.